Yeah, I think of someone like Carl Jung. He definitely, went into the realms of mysticism. I mean, he did forwards for many Eastern tradition books. The Secret of the Golden Flower comes to mind. So he kind of had both sides going on too. So he was kind of merging them, but he never really took it all the way, so to speak, with meditation and contemplation, did he? He just kind of grasped over the surface of it.
Well, he certainly, as you said, pioneered some fascinating forays into the transpersonal arena and was himself obviously a gifted uh, visionary in many ways. And I think you point to an interesting facet of his work, that he was way ahead of his time in opening to visionary experiences. And instead of just dismissing them as either pathology or disordered neuronal fireworks, recognize that they could be uh, mediators or transmitters of symbolic wisdom of a profound and informational kind. And so he really opened in the West the so-called imaginal realm, the realm of vision or archetype or imagery, which has been a part of the contemplative world. But Jung was really a pioneer in bringing this to the forefront of Western psychology and psychiatry. Now, of course, he's remained somewhat out of the mainstream, but he's certainly made an important contribution there. But then there's the other aspect that you pointed to, Kevin, which is that he stayed at that level. He stayed at the level of the imaginal, the visionary, of images and symbolism. And yet the great contemplative traditions tend to push past that. Yes, some of them acknowledge, for example, Tibetan Buddhism makes enormous use of symbols and imagery and has very sophisticated imaginal practices. But they also point through the images, and at their best, the images are, as what Joseph Campbell said, transparent to the transcendent. That is, they point beyond themselves to the transcendent. And that transcendent eventually becomes trans-imaginal, trans-rational, trans-conceptual. It goes beyond concepts, images, ideas, into the realm of formless awareness, pure awareness, transcendent to all thought, all imagery, all mental content of any kind. So that Jung did not go there, you're right.
Is it safe to say that Freud didn't go even close to that?
Well, Freud, Freud was a pioneer in his own time, but I think from our contemporary perspective, we can say that he tended to over-pathologize. That is, understandably, his focus and most of psychiatry's focus has been on pathology and remediating it. There's a problem that sociologists point to, which they call professional deformation. That is, every profession both informs and deforms its practitioners. And in psychiatry, and particularly for Freud, one of the traps of professional deformation is an over-pathologizing perspective, a tendency to view a lot of psychological function in pathological terms. So for Jung, the mystical experience as a sense of unity or oneness, he interpreted as a regression rather than a progression. And it makes sense if you think of the three broad spheres of human development. We come into the world of the so-called pre-conventional, pre-conceptual, pre-rational stage. We don't have thought, we don't have concepts, we don't have a sense of self. So it's pre-personal also. But then as we mature, we develop a sense of self or ego. We develop concepts, we learn how to work with language and images. So we are at then the conceptual or rational or personal level. But it's only quite recently, in the last few decades, particularly since the influx of contemplative traditions into the West and rediscovery of our own Western contemplative traditions, that we've begun to appreciate that there are developmental stages beyond the conventional, beyond the rational, conceptual self, into the transpersonal, transrational, transconceptual, or post-conventional states and stages. And Freud just wasn't aware of the post-conventional, which is not surprising. Almost no one was at that stage in the West.
Right.
So he tended, if you've only got pre-personal or pre-conventional and conventional, then everything's got to fit into those two. If it's not conventional and rational, then it's pre-conventional and pre-rational, i.e. regressive. So he made what's called the pre-trans fallacy. He confused trans-rational experiences with pre-rational ones. And Stacy was still a pioneer, but he had a limited map. And of course, 50 years from now, our maps will probably be pretty limited too.
Let's go back, almost 2,600 years ago. What about Gautama the Buddha? Many people, if the reports are correct, could say that he is the pioneer of therapy. He is the greatest therapist or doctor or scientist. In fact, I believe he referred to himself as a physician. I almost feel like Freud or whoever is almost sometimes teaching an Eastern Buddhist way, almost like the West just didn't want to pay attention to this guy 2,600 years ago and just invented something that was maybe already there.
Well, there are certainly overlaps between some of the Western psychological pioneers and the great contemplative sages like the Buddha or Lao Tzu or Mencius or any number of other sages we can name from multiple traditions, and they have their differences, clearly. And yes, you're right. The Buddha was referred to as the great physician who diagnosed our human condition. That we are prone to unenlightened living, as just suffering is part of unenlightened living, and the cause of that is craving, and the way out is to relinquish craving, and here's how you do it: the Eightfold Path. Live ethically, learn to concentrate, develop a deep insight and understanding, etc., etc. So that's one path now. And to what extent does that overlap with some of the Western pioneers? Well, Freud himself acknowledged that there was a convergence in that both psychoanalysis and the contemplative traditions aimed at deep introspection and self-examination. But he also pointed out that they used different methods. Well, the contemplative practices primarily use direct, self-directed introspection. Psychotherapies employ a relationship as the instrument for introspection, guidance, close guidance and interaction with another person. And each brings out different things. Psychotherapy, for example, if you look at the Buddhist teachings, you find nothing significant about psychological defenses, about repression, denial, projection. You find hints of it. But Western psychotherapy has mapped those out with great precision. Likewise, the Buddha was brilliant on the power of thoughts. In fact, the opening lines of the Dhammapada, one of the core collection of the Buddhist sayings, begins with the words, and I just love these: "We are what we think. All that we are arises with our thoughts. With our thoughts, we make our world." Now, that's masterful cognitive therapy. And contemporary cognitive therapists have mapped out the variety of so-called cognitive distortions, particular kinds of disordered thinking that you never find in Buddhism. For example, in depression, you find three so-called cognitive triad of depression. The depressive tends to think everything's awful, I'm bad, and it's always going to be like that way. Negative beliefs about the world, about myself, and about time. But you never find that kind of precision in the Buddhist analyses, because those things are more easily recognized by another person. Jesus asked Now, once you see the log in your own eye rather than just the speck in your neighbor's, well, the answer is pretty simple now that we know about psychological defenses, is because we're defended against recognizing our own blind spots, but others can see them very easily. So psychotherapy allows us to, with the help of another person, to recognize some of the defenses and blocks that we're just blind to ourselves. So what I would want to point to is the complementarity of these approaches. The Western therapies just have not developed concentration or insight to the level that the contemplative traditions have.
Mm.
And so this is the first time in history we have the possibility of drawing from the wisdom of both these traditions and being the beneficiaries of two streams of wisdom and insight and exploration of the mind and how to help and heal it and actualize it, even transcend it. And we're the beneficiaries for the first time in history.
Mm.
You just heard a clip from the Inner Peace with Dr. Reese podcast. Available on Spotify, Apple Music, YouTube, and more. Subscribe today and move a step closer to liberation.
My friend, in order to keep this podcast free for the public, I could really use your help. I'd love for you to consider becoming a patron. In return, I'll provide you with behind-the-scene updates and bonus material. You can also support by listening to my meditations on Spotify or Apple, buying my books on Amazon or Audible, and by simply sharing my work. I appreciate you. Walk with peace.